Sometimes the most dangerous betrayals come not from enemies, but from those who once whispered promises into your skin. Andrew Callahan was the kind of millionaire whose charm lit up any room. When he entered, he commanded attention with a single glance, his easy confidence woven into every crisp suit. At his side was Sophie, his pregnant, devoted wife, who carried a grace that quietly spoke of loyalty and poise. But lurking in the shadows was Lila Monroe, a striking and ambitious mistress he'd fallen for, despite every warning. On the day the divorce papers were finally signed, Andrew did the unthinkable. He married Lila. Little did he know, Sophie carried a secret that would blow his new marriage apart, and she walked away smiling. Andrew Callahan's rise to wealth had been the kind of story featured on business magazine covers and late-night talk show interviews. Born to a middle-class family in Seattle, Washington, Andrew had shown an early aptitude for finance. After being accepted into Stanford, where he brushed shoulders with future power players, he threw himself into the high-stakes world of mergers and acquisitions. By 35, Andrew had made his first million in a deal that even caught the attention of Warren Buffett, who publicly praised his audacity during a shareholder meeting. That acknowledgement catapulted Andrew to the center of business gossip columns, painting him as a young superstar in the making. It was around this time that he met Sophie Bennett, a bright-eyed social worker from a modest background who, by coincidence, had attended one of his fundraising galas for a children's hospital in San Francisco. Sophie was no stranger to hardship. She'd grown up in a family of 6, barely making ends meet. Something about Andrew's confidence and the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about helping others made her heart flutter. He, on the other hand, found Sophie's quiet strength, her resolve to help people even when her own resources were limited, absolutely magnetic. They dated for a year before he proposed, sliding a ring onto her finger in front of a cheering crowd at a charity event in San Francisco. The wedding was a lavish affair held at the Callahan family's newly purchased Lakeview estate in Oregon. Journalists snapped photos of the bride in her elegant lace gown, tears of joy glistening on her cheeks, while the groom looked every bit the proud millionaire in a sleek black tuxedo. Tabloids ran the headline, "Millionaire Marries Social Worker," alongside glowing pieces about Sophie's grace and poise. People began to see them as a model couple, he with his unstoppable ambition, and she with her unwavering kindness. Over the next year, Andrew's career soared. He poured himself into new ventures, tech startups in Austin, real estate developments in Denver, and even a biotech firm. Magazines described him as the next big thing, with references to Elon Musk's daring or Bill Gates's philanthropic potential. Meanwhile, Sophie worked as a counselor at an underprivileged youth center, devoting her time to forging mentorship programs that changed countless young lives. But behind the scenes, their marriage was not as flawless as it appeared in photos. While Andrew showered Sophie with grand gestures, like surprising her with an orchestra to play at her birthday party or whisking her off to Santorini for a weekend retreat, he also began to chase ever more demanding business prospects. He spent increasing amounts of time traveling and entertaining potential investors. Late-night phone calls became common. He insisted it was part of the job. At first, Sophie believed it wholeheartedly. She never questioned him because she trusted him. But sometimes trust came laced with quiet insecurities. In rooms full of Ivy League alumni and tech moguls, Sophie often felt like an outsider cloaked in borrowed confidence. She came from modest beginnings, a public high school, a scholarship-funded degree, parents who'd worked double shifts their whole lives. She never said it aloud, but sometimes deep in her chest, she feared Andrew's world would eventually reject her like an ill-fitting dress. But trust, even when deep-rooted, begins to bend when left in the shadows too long. On quiet nights, when the soft hum of the refrigerator was her only company, Sophie would stare at the untouched second wine glass and wonder how love could feel so absent yet still wear the same name. He was her husband, the man who had promised to protect her heart and stand beside her, no matter what storms came their way. Yet in the hush of empty hallways and silent dinners, she sometimes felt something was amiss. A sense of loneliness crept in, hinting that the fairy tale might be eroding at the edges. Before long, rumors began to swirl, subtle at first. whispers in boardrooms, raised eyebrows at social gatherings. Then, ironically, a front-page splash in a tabloid. Millionaire Playboy at it again. Sophie brushed it off as malicious gossip. Andrew had always been faithful. At least that was what she wanted to believe. But seeds of doubt were planted, and in the months to come, those seeds would grow into a thorny, tangled reality that would threaten to tear their lives apart. Andrew's days became a blur of power lunches, red-eye flights, and multi-million-dollar negotiations. At times he seemed possessed by the thrill of it all. Untouchable, unstoppable. Whenever Sophie tried to schedule some alone time to reconnect, he'd remind her of a critical meeting or an upcoming investor conference he just couldn't miss. Friends and acquaintances began to wonder if Sophie was simply turning a blind eye to keep the facade of a perfect marriage. In a bid to bridge the growing gap, Sophie decided to plan a special homecoming dinner for Andrew. She spent hours cooking his favorite meal: roasted duck with orange glaze, garlic mashed potatoes, and a side of sautéed asparagus. She set the table with their finest china, a wedding present from her late grandmother. Soft jazz filtered through the living room, candlelight dancing on the walls. Sophie prayed this evening would rekindle the warmth they once shared. Andrew arrived home at 9, exhausted from back-to-back meetings. He plopped onto a dining chair, absent-mindedly loosening his tie. Before he could launch into the same old complaint about work stress, Sophie took a deep breath and announced, "I'm pregnant." For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Andrew's expression cycled through surprise, joy, and then apprehension. He embraced her, wearing a forced smile that Sophie tried to ignore, attributing his tension to wariness. That night, he promised her a real celebration, just not then. He was too tired. Yet the pregnancy did little to slow Andrew's relentless pursuits. He threw himself deeper into his empire-building projects, determined to make an even bigger name for himself. Underneath his professional triumphs, a slow-burning restlessness began to pulse through him. Every time he closed a deal, he felt a fleeting rush, but moments later, an emptiness took hold. It was like chasing a mirage. The satisfaction never lasted. That was when Lila Monroe crossed his path. She was a striking brunette in her late 20s, a marketing consultant with a sharp intellect and an even sharper tongue. She strutted into one of Andrew's cocktail receptions on the arm of an investment banker, dressed in a sleek black gown. She exuded confidence and allure. Andrew couldn't help but notice the way her eyes flickered in his direction. Throughout the evening, Lila, who worked for an up-and-coming PR firm rumored to have ties to big tech, pitched Andrew's company on a new brand development strategy. Their initial conversations were all business, meetings in plush boardrooms, guarded flirtations disguised as witty banter. But as they spent more time together, the chemistry between them crackled with undeniable intensity. Sophie, meanwhile, battled morning sickness that sometimes stretched into the afternoon and night. She visited her doctor alone, waiting on stiff chairs in the clinic, wishing Andrew were there to hold her hand. She told herself he was busy, that he'd be there for the important appointments. But deep down, a shadow of doubt darkened each day. Whenever he returned home, his mind seemed elsewhere, preoccupied, distant. She worried her pregnancy was more of a burden than a blessing to him. But she tried to push that thought away. As Sophie's belly grew, so did her longing for the closeness they once had. But Andrew buried himself deeper in the high-octane world of corporate life. His phone buzzed continuously, texts, emails, late-night calls. The name, Lila Monroe, appeared more frequently in his schedule. Sophie tried to ask him about her once in passing, and he casually brushed it off. "Just a marketing consultant," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. Yet their marriage bed began to feel colder. Andrew worked late, or claimed to. He was too tired for any real conversation. He swore he was just pushing through a tough quarter, but Sophie sensed something else, something that made her heart tighten. The warmth that used to radiate from his touch, his voice, even his footsteps in the hallway, had slowly evaporated into silence. Nights stretched long and quiet, and in the stillness, Sophie's thoughts grew loud. She would sit by the window sometimes, staring out into the darkness, asking herself if this was just stress or the quiet prelude to abandonment. She pretended not to see the suspicious receipts, the overabundance of business dinners, the frequent out-of-town trips. Every time she thought to bring it up, the image of their unborn child flashed before her eyes. She would swallow her fears, convincing herself it was only a phase, that Andrew would soon come around. Little did she know, events were already in motion. The life she had built with Andrew was heading toward a dramatic fork in the road, one that would test every vow they had ever made to each other. Lila Monroe was not the type of woman to settle for mediocrity. Raised in a household that valued glamour over loyalty, she learned early how to work a room and captivate anyone she met. She was every bit as ambitious as Andrew, but her tactics were far more cunning. She loved the thrill of a challenge, and Andrew Callahan was a prize worth chasing. Their encounters shifted from stuffy conference tables to upscale lounges and restaurants. At first, they excused the meetings as essential for finalizing marketing strategies. Over martinis garnished with olives, they'd talk business, flirting behind polite smiles. Often, these evenings ended in the glow of streetlights, with Andrew driving Lila home, both of them lingering at her door longer than they should. Within weeks, their business relationship had evolved into something more intimate. Lila invited him to after-parties, attended by celebrities and influential personalities. She introduced him to her circle of glamorous friends, painting a picture of a life beyond the stable, predictable world he shared with Sophie. Each time, Andrew felt a pang of guilt. Lila would smile, lean in, and whisper that he deserved more in life. More excitement, more passion. In the swirl of neon lights and champagne bubbles, Andrew convinced himself that he was simply exploring possibilities, living his life to the fullest. After all, wasn't he the man everyone admired for his boldness? But as the weeks progressed, the line between excitement and betrayal blurred. They began to meet in secret at luxury hotels. Text messages were exchanged at all hours. The euphoria of their affair was a drug, and Andrew found himself craving the high, even though his conscience told him to stop. Sophie, in her own quiet world, was determined to keep the marriage afloat. She enrolled in prenatal classes, reading up on holistic birthing methods. She painted the spare room in a soft shade of yellow, picking out furniture that would create a tranquil haven for their child. Whenever Andrew seemed stressed, she offered back rubs and words of encouragement. Sometimes he'd mumble a quick thanks, but his eyes betrayed distraction. More cracks appeared in their relationship. Some mornings, Sophie struggled to get out of bed, her blood pressure dipping just low enough to leave her dizzy and disoriented. But she never told Andrew. She didn't want to be a burden, didn't want him to see weakness. So she smiled through the nausea, kept her lips sealed when her legs trembled, and told herself this was what strong women did, carry everything, even when they were breaking. Sophie noticed strange charges on their credit card statements, expensive dinners. At times he claimed to be in meetings, a jewelry store purchase she didn't recognize. She even spotted a faint lipstick stain on his collar once, the color a shade she'd never wear. At night she lay awake, tears soaking her pillow, wondering if she was enough. Andrew, unable to face the truth of his duplicity, adopted a strategy of evasion. He gave Sophie half-baked excuses, claiming everything he did was for the financial security of their growing family. Deep inside, he sensed he was slipping from the man he used to be, a devoted husband who once valued love and loyalty above all else. Friends started noticing the tension. One evening, at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, Sophie sat alone, while Andrew spent most of his time huddled with a group of acquaintances, telling stories of new ventures. She caught him texting under the table. A small frown etched on his brow. When she asked who he was texting, he claimed it was just a colleague. A fleeting sense of shame crossed his features, but it vanished as quickly as it came. Behind the scenes, Lila was orchestrating her maneuvers. She showered Andrew with compliments, fueling his ego. She hinted about a future with him, describing vacations in Monaco and lavish parties in Miami, a shared life free from the mundane responsibilities that came with being married. She played the role of the understanding confidant, someone who got him, who didn't weigh him down with obligations. For Andrew, torn between guilt and infatuation, the affair felt like a whirlwind of adrenaline that kept him from acknowledging the cracks in his conscience. But as the saying goes, every high has its crash, and the higher the climb, the more catastrophic the fall. Neither he nor Lila realized just how destructive their game would become, not just for Sophie, but for themselves as well. One chilly October afternoon, Sophie decided to take the day off from her usual volunteer work and surprised Andrew at his office with homemade cookies, a gesture of warmth she hoped would break through the growing ice between them. Balancing a small basket of chocolate chip delights, she passed through the sleek glass doors of Callahan Ventures. The receptionist greeted her politely, but Sophie sensed a flicker of unease in the woman's eyes. Andrew was in a meeting, or so Sophie was told. She took a seat in the plush waiting area, flipping through a glossy business magazine featuring Andrew's face on the cover. Minutes turned into a quarter hour. Eventually, the elevator doors slid open, and out stepped Lila Monroe, hair perfectly coiffed, wearing a fitted cream-colored dress that accentuated every curve. She paused when she saw Sophie, a momentary flash of surprise crossing her face. Sophie had never seen Lila in person before, but intuition flared. Something in Lila's smug, knowing smile felt like a silent declaration of war. Clutching the basket of cookies tighter, Sophie stood and approached. "You must be Lila Monroe," she said softly, forcing a polite smile. "I've heard Andrew mention you." Lila responded with a practiced grin. "Ah yes, Mrs. Callahan. He's mentioned you too. Congratulations on your pregnancy." The tone was friendly, but Sophie detected a hint of condescension. Lila's gaze dipped, almost dismissively, to Sophie's swelling belly. Before Sophie could reply, Andrew emerged from the conference room, surprise evident on his face to see his wife and mistress in the same space. His posture tensed, but he quickly regained composure. "Soph," he said, striding forward to greet her with a kiss on the cheek. "What a pleasant surprise." He turned to Lila. "I'll see you back at the office later. Thanks for your input." Lila gave them both a parting smile and stepped back into the elevator. Sophie attempted to mask her confusion, her heart pounding. She offered Andrew the basket of cookies, telling him she missed him and wanted to do something thoughtful. Andrew thanked her, but his eyes flicked to the elevator, worry etched in his features. He ushered Sophie into his private office, quickly closing the door behind them. "Listen," he said, clearing his throat. "Lila is just a consultant we hired. She's helping us with some brand strategies for our new project. She can be a bit intense, but she's good at her job." Sophie nodded, forcing a smile. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him, for the sake of their unborn child. But her instincts screamed otherwise. There was something too familiar about the way Lila had looked at her, something that suggested a deep personal involvement with Andrew. Days later, Sophie confided in a close friend, Margaret Turner, a counselor at the youth center. "I'm worried," she admitted, tears brimming. "I can't shake the feeling something is going on between Andrew and that woman." Margaret listened intently, her warm eyes full of empathy. "Have you considered talking to a marriage counselor, Soph? Sometimes an unbiased professional can help clarify these feelings." Sophie nodded. She wanted to do everything she could to save her marriage, but deep down, she feared that if her suspicions proved correct, it would shatter her. That night, long after the lights were out, Sophie lay curled on her side, one hand resting gently over her belly, the other clenched into the blanket. Her mind refused to quiet. What if the man she had loved so wholly had already left her emotionally? What if the vows whispered under the arch of roses meant nothing now, swept away by temptation and silence? Her breath hitched in the dark, and she whispered to her unborn child, "I'm trying, sweetheart. I'm trying so hard." That night she lay awake again, her hand cradling her belly, silently praying for strength. Meanwhile, Andrew's affair with Lila grew bolder. She peppered him with texts and calls at all hours, urging him to break away from his dull domestic life and claim the life he deserved. One morning, Andrew awoke to an email containing explicit photos she'd sent, with a suggestive line hinting at how he should spend his next business trip. In the midst of all this, Sophie discovered she'd been accepted into a specialized prenatal program for couples, aimed at teaching mindfulness and stress reduction techniques. Excited, she broached the subject with Andrew, hoping he'd see it as a chance to reconnect before the baby arrived. He agreed to attend one session, if only to appease her. During that session, The counselor asked them to face each other, place a hand on each other's heart, and express gratitude for the little things. Sophie's eyes misted when she spoke about how Andrew's success had given her the resources to help more people. Andrew mumbled about being grateful for Sophie's support, but the sincerity was hollow, his gaze flicking away when her tears fell. As they left, Sophie felt more alone than ever. The cracks in their marriage had grown into a chasm, and Sophie, with her heart on the line and a child in her womb, began to realize she might be fighting a losing battle. Yet she wasn't one to surrender easily. With every breath, she reminded herself of the life inside her, of the love she once shared with Andrew. She clung to hope, even as the specter of betrayal loomed larger by the day. Lila Monroe had an agenda far more calculated than Andrew realized. She was well aware of Sophie's pregnancy. News traveled quickly in social circles, especially when the father was a high-profile millionaire. While Andrew saw their affair as a thrilling escape, Lila saw a jackpot. She had dated wealthy men before, but none with Andrew's clout or potential. She wanted to secure her position in his life, and more importantly, in his bank accounts. She began with small manipulations. Whenever Andrew expressed concern about his wife's well-being, Lila subtly mocked Sophie's fragile state, suggesting that perhaps Sophie wasn't strong enough to be the partner he needed. She never outright told him to leave his wife. Instead, she planted seeds of doubt, letting them take root in Andrew's mind. To further entangle him, she proposed that he invest in an exclusive real estate venture she was supposedly helping spearhead, promising massive returns. She dangled the prospect of prestige and influence. "Just imagine," she purred into his ear one evening at a penthouse party. "You and I at the top of this city's social ladder, owning prime blocks of property, shaping the skyline. It's everything you've worked for, Andrew." The dream she painted was irresistible to a man addicted to success. Still, Lila sensed that Andrew hesitated, chained by guilt and a sense of obligation to his pregnant wife. So she upped her game. She made sure her presence was felt in every facet of his life. She'd show up unexpectedly at his office with lunch, always dressed in a way that made heads turn. She emailed him detailed breakdowns of her business idea, ensuring he saw how much she'd done just for him. During late-night rendezvous, she lavished him with praise, making him feel like an unstoppable force. Even Andrew's business partners began to notice the shift. A few discreetly cautioned him about getting too involved, but he was too far gone in his double life. He wanted Lila's excitement, her audacious energy, yet he also wanted to maintain the respectability of his marriage, particularly with a child on the way. He assured himself that he could handle it. Sophie, meanwhile, was retreating into her own silent world of heartbreak. She hardly recognized the man Andrew was becoming, but she still clung to the dream of a happy family. Sometimes she'd reread the vows they exchanged, tracing each word with her fingertip as if willing the promise back to life. There were nights when she wondered if she was to blame, if somehow, in trying so hard to be strong, she had grown too quiet, too forgiving. But even in those moments of doubt, she refused to let go of hope. Because hope, however fragile, was all she had left to hold. In her quiet moments, she collected her thoughts, writing in a journal about her hopes for the baby and the love she once felt from Andrew. If he would just snap out of it, she told herself, everything could be saved. A turning point came when Lila managed to corner Sophie at a charity event. Sophie was volunteering as part of the youth center's fundraising committee, helping set up tables and greeting donors. Lila arrived on Andrew's arm, wearing a figure-hugging red dress. Publicly, she was introduced simply as a colleague, but the knowing looks between them told Sophie everything. Andrew barely spoke to Sophie the whole night, preoccupied with parading Lila among wealthy benefactors, forging new connections. At one point, Sophie found herself alone in a hallway, gathering her composure. That's when Lila materialized, like a phantom. She leaned against the wall, a smirk playing on her glossy lips. "I've heard you're expecting soon," Lila said. "Must be nice to know that Andrew's going to be a father. He's great with children, isn't he?" The question dripped with insinuation. Sophie's chest tightened. "Yes, he'll be a wonderful father," she replied, forcing a polite tone despite the anger burning inside her. Inside, her heart thudded with a mix of fury and shame. There was venom behind every word Lila spoke, a calculated performance meant to unsettle, to assert dominance. But Sophie stood her ground, holding herself upright not just for pride, but for the life she carried. She would not let the other woman see her break. Not here. Not like this. Lila's expression was smug, practically victorious. Well, I hope you're taking good care of yourself. Stress isn't good for the baby. With that, she sauntered off, leaving Sophie trembling. In the car ride home, Sophie confronted Andrew through tears, asking him outright if he was having an affair. He denied it vehemently, raising his voice in an uncharacteristic outburst. "Why must you always assume the worst?" he snapped, ignoring the tear-streaked look of betrayal on her face. "Lila is a critical part of our new marketing push. You have no idea how business works." Sophie withdrew, hugging her belly protectively. She realized that no matter how much she wanted to fix things, Andrew was spiraling into a world that had no space for her. Yet there was a spark of determination left. If Andrew was slipping away, she would fight to preserve her dignity, even if it meant letting him go. Unbeknownst to both of them, Lila had more tricks up her sleeve. She wasn't satisfied just being the mistress. She craved legitimacy, adoration, and the glittering promise of marriage. And in her mind, she had already begun orchestrating the downfall of Sophie Callahan. It was late November when Andrew received a cryptic message from Lila. "We need to talk. Urgent." He glanced at the text, nerves on edge, wondering if she was about to drop a bombshell. Perhaps a pregnancy scare, or maybe some business deal gone awry. He left his office early to meet her at a discreet lounge a few blocks away. Lila arrived wearing a long trench coat cinched at the waist, her eyes hidden behind large sunglasses. She slipped into the booth across from him and ordered a glass of Merlot. Without preamble, she began. "Andrew, I'm tired of playing second fiddle. We need to make a decision about us." Alarm bells rang in Andrew's mind. He sipped his whiskey, trying to project calm. "What do you mean?" "I've given you every opportunity to be happy," she said, her gaze unwavering. "And yet you're still going home to Sophie. She's pregnant, sure. But be honest with yourself. Are you truly in love with her?" Andrew exhaled, feeling cornered. He couldn't deny his passion for Lila, yet he also couldn't sever the bond with his wife, especially with a baby on the way. It was as if he stood on a precarious cliff, the slightest push sending him tumbling into an abyss. "This is complicated," he managed. "I do care about Sophie. She's the mother of my child." Lila sneered, her composure cracking. "Care about her all you want, Andrew, but that won't change the fact that we have something real. And if you're not going to make it official, I might have to look elsewhere." The threat hung in the air like poison. He should have walked away then, but instead, he found himself apologizing, trying to placate her. The conversation ended with a promise that he'd sort out his marital issues soon. That night, he stared at Sophie asleep in their bed, her hand protectively over her belly. Guilt and longing warred in his mind. Meanwhile, Sophie was not as naive as Andrew assumed. She'd hired a private investigator, a middle-aged ex-cop named Walter Green, who discreetly followed Andrew's movements. Within a week, Walter delivered photographs. Andrew and Lila entering a hotel lobby, leaving hand in hand, sharing an intimate moment in the car. The evidence was damning, heart-pounding. Sophie spread the photos across her kitchen table. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to give in to despair. She was pregnant, vulnerable, but she was not powerless. She consulted a divorce lawyer recommended by Margaret. The lawyer suggested she gather more evidence before filing. If Andrew was going to betray her, at least she would secure her child's future. Andrew's phone buzzed continuously with Lila's messages. Some nights he escaped to Lila's penthouse. Others he stayed at the office, burying himself in spreadsheets and mergers to numb the guilt. His company's board members were beginning to talk. Even his longtime friend and financial advisor, Daniel Wu, took him aside. "One day, whatever's going on in your personal life, get it under control," Daniel warned, "or you'll lose everything you've built." But Andrew was too entangled in Lila's web. Each time he tried to break it off, she'd reel him back with promises or threats. She'd whisper about the incredible future they could share, while also reminding him of how easily she could create a scandal that would ruin him. Stuck in a vortex of lust, ambition, and fear, Andrew pushed forward as if by inertia. At home, Sophie continued to play the beautiful wife, cooking dinners that he rarely touched, updating him on doctor visits he never attended. A new routine set in. He'd mumble excuses. She'd pretend to believe them, all while carefully gathering evidence. She knew confronting him outright would only make him defensive. Patience, she realized, could be her greatest weapon. The tension weighed heavily in the mansion's air. House staff walked on eggshells, noticing the forced smiles, the stony silences. Friends saw less and less of the couple socially, as invitations were often extended to Andrew plus Lila, instead of Andrew and Sophie. The dream life they had flaunted for magazines was collapsing brick by brick. And yet, beneath Sophie's heartbreak lay a resolute core of strength. She had a child to protect, and she refused to be cast aside without a fight. Even if it meant letting Andrew go, she'd do it on her own terms. Little did Andrew realize the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The day Sophie would finally stand tall, unveiling truth after truth, and leaving him utterly shell-shocked by the consequences of his betrayal. By the time Sophie reached her 8th month of pregnancy, she had all the evidence she needed. The private investigator's photos, phone records linking Andrew and Lila's clandestine meetups, even eyewitness accounts from a few hotel staff who recognized Andrew. The heartbreak was immense, but Sophie channeled her pain into a clear focus: protect herself and her unborn child. One evening, she prepared a special dinner at home. She set the table elegantly, placing 2 tall candles in the center. She wore a simple but graceful maternity dress that accentuated her rounded belly. When Andrew walked in, his tie-loose coat hung over his arm, he paused at the sight of the well-set table. "What's all this?" he asked wearily. Sophie forced a smile, pushing past the hurt lodged in her chest. "I thought we should have a conversation over dinner." He nodded, trying to recall the last time they'd had a civil meal together. They sat, clinking glasses of sparkling water. The tension in the air was thick as Sophie served them grilled salmon with lemon butter sauce. After a few bites, she said quietly, "Andrew, I know about Lila." She spoke the name plainly, without drama. He nearly choked on his fish, the color draining from his face. "Soph, let me explain," he began, but she raised a hand to stop him. She wasn't interested in excuses. Sophie pulled out a folder containing the evidence. She handed it to him, her eyes unwavering. "I've spoken to a lawyer. I'm prepared to file for divorce." Andrew thumbed through the pages, his face contorting into shock and guilt. "You hired someone to follow me?" he asked, half angry, half astonished. "I did what I had to do," she said. "You lied to me for months. You flaunted that woman in public, and I may have a child to raise soon. Our child. But that doesn't mean I'll tolerate disrespect or betrayal." Andrew swallowed hard, tears forming in the corners of his eyes. Part of him wanted to apologize, to plead for forgiveness, but another part, the side influenced by Lila's cunning whispers, told him not to show weakness. "Look, Sophie, I'm sorry you found out this way. But you have to understand, our marriage hasn't exactly been perfect." Sophie's voice trembled only slightly as she cut him off. "Is that supposed to be an excuse?" She let out a shaky breath, placing a protective hand on her belly. "I'm giving you a choice. We can go through with the divorce, or we can try to work on our marriage. But if we try to work on it, you have to end all contact with Lila, immediately, irrevocably, and you have to seek counseling with me. Otherwise, I file the papers." Andrew hesitated, remembering Lila's ultimatum and her repeated promises of a thrilling future. He also recognized the gravity of Sophie's request. She was his wife, the mother of his child, the woman who had stood by him when he was nobody. But the hold Lila had on him was strong, and the idea of losing that rush felt suffocating. "I need time to think," he stammered. He could see the disappointment flicker across Sophie's face. Nonetheless, she simply nodded, tears threatening to spill over, and stood from the table. "You have 1 week," she said softly. "By then, I'll expect your decision." With that, she turned and headed upstairs, leaving her untouched dinner plate on the table. That night, Andrew slept in his study, too conflicted to face his pregnant wife. He tossed and turned on the leather couch, phone in hand, scrolling through messages from Lila. Reading the latest property deal she dangled in front of him, he thought about his unborn child, the empire he had built, and the public scandal this would unleash if he went through with a divorce. Stress consumed him. as did a gnawing fear of losing everything. In the darkness, the silence screamed louder than any argument ever could. He tried to justify Lila's ambition as a match to his own, but each time he thought of Sophie upstairs, carrying the life they created, something in his chest twisted painfully. He wasn't sure anymore if he was running toward something or simply running away from the guilt. 3 days later, he still hadn't given Sophie his decision. Instead, he met Lila at a secluded bar, telling her about Sophie's ultimatum. "I can't keep living like this," he admitted, frustration clouding his features. Lila's response was immediate. "Leave her. You said it yourself. The marriage is basically over. Why not finalize it? We can go public and shape a narrative that suits us." She pinned him with a direct stare, then added, "I can give you a life that Sophie never could. You know that." Her voice was velvet wrapped around venom, and for a moment, Andrew let himself believe her fantasy, one where Sophie was the obstacle and not the casualty. In the haze of whiskey and Lila's unwavering gaze, Andrew agreed he'd divorce Sophie. He found himself rationalizing it. Better to end it cleanly than drag out a dead marriage. And he was certain Lila was the more exciting choice. "I'll talk to my lawyer," he muttered, ignoring the pang of sorrow in his chest. Soon after, Sophie received the news in the form of a curt conversation with Andrew. He stood rigid, telling her he wanted a divorce. She didn't scream or cry in front of him. She simply listened, nodded, and retreated to the bedroom. Only when she was alone did she allow tears to flow, sobs racking her body as she held her pregnant belly, murmuring apologies to her unborn child for the broken home it would enter. Her arms curled protectively around herself, not just shielding the baby but bracing her own heart from shattering further. She had loved Andrew with the kind of loyalty that endures silence and shadows, but even loyalty had its limits. Little did Andrew realize, the divorce would not be the final act. Instead, it would be the opening scene of a drama that would twist in ways none of them expected. Especially on the day he pledged himself to Lila, while Sophie remained in the shadows, holding on to an explosive truth. The news of Andrew and Sophie's divorce spread like wildfire through high society circles. Gossip columnists had a field day. Millionaire dumps pregnant wife for sultry mistress. While Andrew tried to manage the narrative, Lila embraced the attention, orchestrating exclusive interviews that portrayed their relationship as fated and irresistible. She even hinted that the timing of Sophie's pregnancy had been an attempt to cling to a failing marriage, which only fueled tabloid speculation. Sophie retreated from the public eye. She needed to focus on her health and the babies. A few close friends rallied around her, offering emotional support and discreet legal advice, but she remained stoic. She refused to beg Andrew to stay or to make a spectacle of herself in the media. Stepping back from the spotlight, however, came with a price. Sophie had always found purpose in her work at the youth center, mentoring girls who'd once felt as lost as she now did. But now, each time she walked past her office door, nausea twisted in her stomach. She took an indefinite leave, citing doctor's orders, though in truth, it was her heart that needed rest. Without her work, without Andrew, without even the public to defend against, she sometimes felt adrift, like a supporting character in her own life. She allowed her lawyers to handle most of the negotiations, ensuring she and her child would be financially stable once the divorce was finalized. In a matter of weeks, the divorce went through, astonishingly quick for such a high-profile couple. Money and influence smoothed out the usual bureaucratic hurdles. Andrew's team spun the story as a mutual decision, but the tabloids screamed otherwise. Sophie's lawyer secured a hefty settlement package, but the heartbreak overshadowed any material gain. Andrew had barely signed the final documents when Lila insisted on a destination wedding. She was hungry for the spotlight and wanted to prove her status as the new Mrs. Callahan. They chose Lake Como, Italy, for its picturesque scenery, renting out a luxurious villa perched on the water's edge. High-profile guests received elaborate invitations embossed with gold leaf. Celebrities, business moguls, and socialites from across Europe and America flew in. Cameras clicked incessantly, capturing Lila in a stunning designer gown as she made her grand entrance. Andrew stood at the altar, looking dapper in a custom-tailored tux. He tried to focus on the moment, ignoring the pang of regret that flickered whenever he thought of Sophie. He reassured himself this was his fresh start, a leap toward a more exciting life. Lila glided down the aisle, her smile wide and triumphant. The ceremony was lavish. Flowers imported from Holland, a string quartet flown in from Vienna, champagne from the finest vineyards in France. It was everything Lila had dreamed of. Back in the States, Sophie watched the headlines in quiet resignation. She was close to her due date and decided not to dwell on Andrew's public spectacle. Her child's health and her own peace of mind were her priorities. Besides, she had uncovered something that would turn this entire narrative on its head. Lila was not who she claimed to be. With the help of Walter Green, the private investigator, Sophie had discovered a tangled web of forged documents, shell companies, and bankrupt accounts linked to Lila Monroe. It appeared Lila had orchestrated elaborate cons on past lovers, siphoning money through dubious real estate deals and marketing ventures. Several of Lila's former associates had been swindled, some too ashamed to go public. But now, Sophie had a folder of evidence that threatened to expose Lila as a fraud. Sophie decided to hold on to that folder for the moment, letting the wedding spectacle unfold. She sensed that unveiling the truth at the right time could ensure that Andrew wouldn't weasel out of his responsibilities as a father. Moreover, she felt it was better for him to discover Lila's true nature when he was at his most complacent. After all, if he was brazen enough to marry his mistress immediately after divorcing her while she was still pregnant, perhaps he deserved the harsh lesson fate was about to deliver. And so in Italy, under the shimmering lights of a grand villa, Andrew said "I do" to Lila. They exchanged vows in front of a cheering crowd. A high-profile priest flown in just for the occasion declared them man and wife. Fireworks lit the night sky, champagne flowed, and paparazzi snapped countless pictures for the gossip magazines to devour. But as Andrew and Lila shared their first dance, a quiet storm was brewing, thousands of miles away. It was a storm named Sophie, carrying the knowledge of Lila's lies like a secret weapon. At home, in her modest bedroom, Sophie held a copy of the evidence in her hands. She gently set it aside, placed a hand on her very pregnant belly, and smiled, a small, knowing smile. She knew the wedding was only an intermission, not the end of the story. And when the final act played out, Lila Monroe would wish she had never underestimated the woman she tried so hard to destroy. Sophie went into labor a month after Andrew's grand Italian wedding. She found herself in a private hospital suite, courtesy of the settlement from the divorce. Even though she was alone, except for a few close friends, she felt a surge of both fear and exhilaration. This child would be her anchor, the one pure thing born from a turbulent marriage. Complications arose during labor, prompting an emergency C-section. Margaret Turner clutched Sophie's hand as medical staff wheeled her into surgery. Hours later, a healthy baby boy was delivered, and Sophie breathed a sigh of relief. She named him James Douglas Callahan, honoring her family name and acknowledging his father's lineage. Andrew learned of his son's birth through social media. Distorted rumors claimed Sophie was in critical condition, though that wasn't true. Still, guilt stabbed at him for not being there. Lila suggested he send flowers or a polite message. After all, she rationalized, we don't want the media to think you're a deadbeat dad. But a part of Andrew insisted on visiting in person, if only to see his child. He arrived at the hospital the next evening, hoping to avoid the paparazzi. Dressed in a discreet hoodie and sunglasses, he found Sophie's private room. She was sitting up in bed, cradling tiny James in her arms. The boy's delicate features stirred something in Andrew, a flicker of paternal love. He hadn't expected to feel so strongly. For a few moments, he stood silently, absorbing the sight of his newborn son and the serene strength in Sophie's face. Sophie acknowledged him with a nod. "You can hold him," she said softly, offering the baby. Andrew hesitated before gently taking James, supporting his head as he gazed down at his child. A wave of emotion washed over him, momentarily dissolving the tension between them. "How are you?" he asked, voice shaky with genuine concern. Sophie nodded. "Tired, but relieved. He's healthy. That's all that matters." A tense silence followed. Then Sophie cleared her throat. "Andrew, you should know, there are things about Lila you aren't aware of." He frowned, stiffening. "She's my wife now, Sophie. I'm not sure I want to hear. Sophie held up a hand. Listen to me. I have proof. She's been running cons under aliases for years. She's scammed people out of thousands, maybe millions of dollars. She's not the woman you think she is. Andrew glared, torn between anger and confusion. Is this some ploy to ruin my marriage? He snapped. Sophie sighed, stroking James's tiny fingers. Why would I lie? She's done more harm to you than you realize. Check her financial records. Talk to the people she's scammed. Don't let her drag you into legal or financial ruin. Before Andrew could respond, the door swung open, revealing Lila herself. Decked in designer clothes, she looked thoroughly out of place in the hospital corridor. Her expression soured when she saw Andrew cradling his son. She quickly recovered, turning to Sophie. I heard you were here, she said coldly. So I came to see if everything was all right. Sophie offered a tight smile. We're fine, she replied, glancing at Lila's manicured nails. Thanks for your concern. Lila's eyes flitted to the baby. So, that's James, I suppose, she managed, a lukewarm smile that didn't reach her eyes. Andrew found himself shifting uncomfortably, the baby still in his arms. The tension in the room was palpable. Sensing an impending confrontation, Sophie's doctor walked in, checking on the new mother. The baby should get some rest, the doctor advised, ushering Lila and Andrew toward the hallway. Once outside, Lila attempted to link her arm through Andrew's. Let's go. We should get a drink and talk. But he pulled away, mind still grappling with Sophie's words. Give me a moment, he mumbled, pacing near the wall. Lila shot him an icy stare. Don't tell me you believe her lies. She's desperate to paint me as some villain. She's threatened by our marriage. Andrew didn't respond immediately. A swirl of doubt had already formed. The problem was, deep down, he knew Sophie was not the type to spin elaborate falsehoods. She was the woman who had always been straightforward, sometimes painfully so. I need proof, he finally said to Lila. Show me your financials. Put my mind at ease. Lila's face blanched, but she recovered swiftly. What do you think this is, an interrogation? She hissed. I'm your wife. You're supposed to trust me. Trust is earned, he shot back, surprising even himself. If you have nothing to hide, you'll show me. Lila's lips tightened in anger. Without another word, she stormed off down the hallway, leaving Andrew behind, torn between the newborn son he felt drawn to and the woman he had chosen in a haze of infatuation. If Sophie's allegations were true, his entire world was about to explode. And if they were false, he risked alienating his new wife. Caught in the middle, Andrew could only stare at the hospital corridor, uncertain which direction to follow and which choice would haunt him more. After leaving the hospital, Andrew found himself haunted by Sophie's revelations about Lila. He pushed for answers, combing through public records and discreetly checking with his legal team. At first, they uncovered nothing alarming, mostly because Lila had been careful. But a few well-placed phone calls to her supposed real estate partners yielded conflicting stories. Some claimed never to have heard of her. Others said she'd disappeared after complicated deals. The puzzle pieces began to align. Meanwhile, Lila caught wind of Andrew's snooping and retaliated. She insisted he sign power of attorney forms, allowing her to handle some upcoming investments, framing it as a way to simplify his busy schedule. When he hesitated, she raged, throwing accusations and threats. You don't trust me? She shouted one evening in their opulent living room. Why did you marry me if you can't give me the freedom to help run our affairs? Andrew's patience wore thin. I married you because I thought we had something special, he retorted. Now? I'm not so sure. Her eyes flashed with hatred. She stormed off, slamming the door, and didn't return that night. But Andrew wasn't alone. He spent hours calling contacts and scanning financial statements. The deeper he dug, the clearer the picture became. Lila was a fraud, a con artist who specialized in ensnaring wealthy men. During this tumultuous period, Sophie settled into motherhood, focusing on baby James. Despite her heartbreak, she found profound joy in caring for her son. Late-night feedings and lullabies replaced the noise of tabloids and gossip. She made a point of never speaking ill of Andrew to James, and she filed away the heartbreak in a locked chamber of her heart. When she felt strong enough, she instructed her lawyer to finalize the custody and visitation terms with Andrew's legal team. She wanted James to know his father, provided Andrew could be responsible. One afternoon, A courier arrived at Sophie's door with an envelope addressed to her. She opened it carefully, finding a thick wad of legal documents from Andrew's lawyer. At the top was a note, scribbled by Andrew himself. "Sophie, I owe you an apology. You were right about Lila. Please look at these documents. I want to ensure James and you are protected. Let's discuss custody arrangements in person." Andrew skimming through the pages, Sophie learned that Andrew had begun divorce proceedings against Lila, citing fraud and emotional distress. He was also reorganizing his assets to ensure Lila couldn't claim a share of his core business holdings. A sense of relief washed over her, knowing that the truth was finally emerging. But it wasn't over yet. Lila unleashed a final hailstorm of vengeance. Once she realized Andrew planned to divorce her, she went public with salacious tales, painting Andrew as an abusive manipulator who had cast her aside. She threatened to sue for a massive alimony settlement, claiming she'd given up her career to be at his side. She even claimed to be pregnant, though nobody could verify it. The tabloids ate it up, and Andrew's reputation wavered. His shareholders grew anxious. The stock price for one of his newer ventures dipped. That was the moment Sophie decided to act. She might have moved on from Andrew romantically, but she had no desire to watch him be destroyed, especially when it might hurt her son's future. She reached out to a trusted journalist, Sarah Donovan, an old acquaintance who had interviewed Andrew years ago. Sophie handed over the files incriminating Lila, the forged signatures, the false business claims, testimonies from past victims. She explained the entire sordid saga on the condition that Sarah would wait for court validation before publishing. In a high-stakes courtroom showdown, Andrew's legal team presented overwhelming evidence against Lila. Lawyers brought forth witnesses, former partners, private investigators, who spoke of her deceitful tactics. Financial forensics revealed shell corporations used to launder stolen funds. Each exhibit was a nail in the coffin of Lila's carefully curated image. Furious, Lila screeched about defamation and sabotage, but the judge found her statements inconsistent and her credibility in tatters. When the final gavel struck, the court ruled in Andrew's favor. The marriage was declared null due to fraudulent circumstances. Lila was ordered to pay restitution for any assets proven to be stolen or misrepresented. As she was escorted out by court security, the paparazzi captured her meltdown, eyes wild, hair disheveled, cursing Andrew and Sophie in a venomous tirade. The next day's headlines read, "Fraudulent Mistress Exposed, Andrew Callahan Free of Con Artist Bride." For Andrew, the aftermath was a bitter relief. He had lost credibility in many circles, but the truth had come out. He also realized the depth of the pain he'd inflicted on Sophie. After the dust settled, he called her and asked to see baby James. She agreed to a meeting at a cozy cafe near the hospital where James was born. When Andrew arrived, he found Sophie waiting with James dozing in a stroller. The hush of the cafe and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee gave the encounter a subdued warmth. Andrew quietly sat across from Sophie, eyes dropping to the baby. Guilt and regret lined his face. "How is he?" Andrew asked, voice thick. Sophie smiled gently. "He's thriving, growing so quickly, he'll be crawling before we know it." Andrew swallowed hard, guilt flooding him. "Soph, I'm sorry, I can't say it enough. I was a fool." She studied him for a moment, then reached out to pat his hand. "Our marriage is over, Andrew," she said, her tone honest, yet not unkind. "But that doesn't mean we can't work together to raise our son." He nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "Thank you for standing up for me in court. You could have let Lila destroy me." Sophie shook her head. "I did it for James. He deserves a future where his father isn't tied up in lawsuits and scandal. And part of me still respects the good man you used to be." Andrew exhaled, relief and sorrow mingling. "I want to be that man again," he whispered, gently brushing his fingers over James's tiny hand. They spent the next hour discussing visitation schedules, financial planning for James' education, and how to navigate co-parenting. It wasn't an easy conversation. Emotions simmered beneath the surface. Love, betrayal, regret. But there was also a mutual desire to provide the best life for their child. By the time they parted ways, Sophie felt a weight lift from her shoulders. They weren't returning to the life they had, but they were forging a new path. One grounded in honesty, if not love. Andrew watched them go, a swirl of regret and admiration filling his heart. He knew he'd forever be marked by the choice he made to chase a fleeting thrill with Lila. And Sophie, for her part, walked away with her head held high, proud of the grace she maintained in the face of heartbreak. The next morning, newspapers displayed photos of a distraught Lila leaving the courthouse, overshadowed by articles praising Sophie's quiet dignity. Tabloid interest soon shifted to other scandals, leaving Andrew and Sophie to navigate their complicated new reality in relative peace. Thus ended the whirlwind saga of betrayal, heartbreak, and deceit. Andrew Callahan, once seduced by the allure of a cunning mistress, emerged bruised but wiser. Sophie Bennett, his pregnant wife, left smiling on divorce day, had always known the truth. That Lila was a fraud waiting to be exposed. She stood her ground, protected her child, and refused to be a victim. In the end, Andrew and Sophie found an uneasy truce, both determined to raise baby James in a stable environment. Their story became a cautionary tale, proving that no amount of wealth or glamour can mask a guilty conscience or hide deception forever. Dear friend, life rarely offers neat conclusions. It gives us lessons instead, some painful, some redemptive. Like Andrew, many of us only recognize the value of what we had after we've risked it all for illusions. And like Sophie, sometimes the greatest strength is not in holding on, but in letting go. With dignity, with grace, and with the quiet conviction to protect what truly matters. The Stoics taught us that we cannot control what others do, only how we respond. Sophie didn't let betrayal define her. She defined herself in spite of it. In choosing peace over revenge, she reclaimed her power, and in choosing growth over shame, Andrew began the path back to integrity. If this story moved you, take a moment to like, share it with someone who might need it today, and subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart and the human spirit.